To me, the Christmas tradition conjures warm feelings and nostalgic memories, and it's hard not to associate it with good times when values like spreading Christmas cheer and spending time with our family and our friends lie at its core. We decorate our houses, inside and out, with sparkling lights and festively colored knickknacks and candy canes. We light apple cinnamon candles and cook elaborate Christmas dinners. We set up evergreen trees, garlands, and wreaths, adding that extra touch of Christmas aroma to our homes. And of course, even these don't escape our decorating fever. And rounding out this collective fantasy of good spirits and ornate decorations and hearty meals is a national holiday off work, and one in which we exchange gifts with those closest to us to boot. Now, the word Christianity itself has as its root the centerpiece of the Christian religion, Christ. But interestingly, most of the traditions I just described have little to do with an historical Jewish boy born on the east banks of the Mediterranean over 2,000 years ago. And especially in the 20th century, the Christmas holiday has become increasingly secularized, meaning non-religious, assimilating modern art and now marketing into what appears to be a collective agreement to buy gifts, dress our homes up, and partake in one last celebration before the new year. But long before the birth of Jesus, the depths of winter were celebrated for another reason, and many of the ideas and behaviors we think of as synonymous with Christmas were actually shunned by the church until only a century ago. So how did a fat, bearded North Pole native come to clandestinely deliver gifts, and sometimes coal, down the chimneys of billions of homes in a single night, and be celebrated alongside the newborn baby Jesus? Well, let's find out. Jesus, I'm sure most of you know, is an historical first-century Jewish preacher and religious prophet from Nazareth, the capital and the largest city in the northern district of modern-day Israel. Being central to Christianity, most Christians believe he is the actual incarnation of God in human flesh. This actually is an interesting logical argument, and once I looked into it, for the divinity of an apparent man. Briefly, if you consider what the definition of God is, he's a deity, omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, all-present. He doesn't seem to lack anything, except, as one rabbi commented on the Torah, saying, the one thing he does lack is limitation itself. And this is actually remedied by having a mortal son. So by this logic, the ultimate unity or oneness of the Judeo-Christian God is theoretically fulfilled by manifesting himself in the human form, called the Christ, meaning the Messiah, as prophesied in the Old Testament of the Bible. So, that's a long, extremely brief precursor to, who Christ is, even. The name Christmas, now, as you can imagine, has the root of Christ in it, is a shortened form of the phrase Christ's Mass. Christ's Mass. Mass, in this sense, apparently has multiple origins, from what I found. The English noun Mass is derived from the Middle Latin Missa. Wow, I just thought of Jar Jar Binks there. That's sad. The Latin term Missa itself was in use by the 6th century. It's most likely derived from the concluding formula Ite missa est, or go, the dismissal is made, to which is said at the end of a priest's sermon, often in Latin, and to which the mass of people traditionally respond, Deo gratias, or gracious, thanks be to God. But I also found some other explanations for the term Mass. Has not derived from that formula, ite missa est. Fortescue, a philologist, I believe, or religious critic, Fortescue, from the early 20th century, 1910, cites older etymological explanations, such as the Latinization of the Hebrew matzah, which even I remember my Jewish friends talking, about eating and during their holidays, unleavened bread, which means it doesn't rise, or the term oblation, which I actually don't know what that means. Not sure what oblation means. Maybe we could look that up real quick. Oblation. Immediately think of oblong, oblation. Let's find out. Oblation. Spell it right first of all. A thing presented or offered to God. It's almost like almost like a sacrifice, a libation. That's what I think of, the Greek term. Alright, cool. Always learning. So matzah might be an origin of Mass. Greek meiesis, or initiation, might be another origin, or even the Germanic mise, or messe, means assembly. In the modern understanding, though, it's a church service, sometimes called the communion or Eucharist. That's actually an important reenactment in accordance with Jesus' instruction in the Last Supper before his death, the night before his death. A request that his followers do this in remembrance of when he gave his disciples bread, saying, "This is my body," and wine, saying, "This is my blood." The word Christ was given to Jesus of Nazareth when his contemporaries began to believe that he was actually the prophesied coming of God in human flesh, as predicted in the 1,000 or 2,000 years of Jewish religious tradition up to that point. It comes from the Hebrew word Messiah. And I think very, very roughly that might be how it's pronounced, like extremely roughly. That's where the word Christ, initially Christ, Jesus, was called the Hebrew word for Messiah, which means, or the Hebrew word for anointed, which is roughly pronounced Messiah, and then that was translated into ancient Greek, which was modern Greek at the time, and anointed in Greek is Christos, and you can imagine the further progression towards Christ from Christos. So, the traditional Christmas Eve church service then represents a congregation or a mass of Christians at a church mass or a sermon service, as well as the celebration of Jesus' birth as God's incarnation in the form of a human body of matter, or mass, if you're scientifically oriented, being the technical definition of mass, the mass of an object. And his body was sacrificed, and all these conjunctions of the word mass kind of inform the modern day meaning of mass. Christmas is a phrase recorded almost 1,000 years ago in 1038 AD. But the origins of a midwinter holiday go much further back in time. The middle of winter has long been a time celebrated around the world, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Centuries before the arrival of a man named Jesus, early Europeans celebrated the light and birth in the darkest days of winter. Current astronomy recognizes the winter solstice being the midwinter day with the shortest number of daylight hours, roughly around December 21st to 23rd. It varies, fluctuates. Many people rejoiced during the winter solstice when the worst of winter was behind them, so they could look forward to longer days and extended hours of sunlight. And I thought about this, in a prehistoric, pre-scientific, mythology-saturated environment. In these epics, in these times, in the way everybody interpreted the world, it's easy to see the metaphorical significance of a shift in the decreasing of the daylight hours, the lengthening of the night, at a point exactly in the dead of winter when the careful astronomers, the priests, those who worshipped the celestial bodies would undoubtedly have noticed the day started lengthening by a couple minutes each day, but over a week or two, it's noticeable. It turns into a half hour, then an hour, until by the middle of summer, you are at the point of the year, which is the summer solstice, at which the day is significantly longer than the night. So the daylight hours are at a maximum. Winter solstice is the opposite, where the night, the darkness in the depths of winter to boot, is at a maximum. You could imagine this being a significant point in the year, in the shift in the seasons. In the same way, a glimmer of hope given by the vision of a better, brighter, optimistic, positive future might revitalize us after overcoming a tragic obstacle in life. In that same vein, the collective observation of our star's victory over the encroaching darkness of night at this point in the year signifies the coming fertility of spring and the nourishing warmth that precedes it. Although watching a drama unfold, as though watching a drama unfold between the good light and the evil darkness, it was no doubt worth celebrating something of such cosmic significance. In Scandinavia, the Norse celebrated this turning point in their celestial battle between light and darkness as Yule. I don't know why I was so robotic when I just did that. They celebrated from December 21st, the winter solstice roughly, through January. In the Eastern Europe, the midwinter festival, marking this roughly the same date, is called Kolleda. In recognition of the re-emergence of the sun, fathers and sons and their sons would bring home large logs, Yule logs, which would be set on fire. The people would then feast until the log burned out. Sometimes it would take as many as 12 days. As with many rituals in the past, the miracle of conception and childbirth, and it truly is a miracle. I know doctors obviously know a lot more than the average Joe about biology, but nonetheless, the way our brains and our bodies work and how we all just grew out of a sperm and an egg and a clump of cells. I mean, that's the closest thing to magic I could point to, really. So, of course, such a phenomenon would be celebrated and incorporated into festivals and rituals and something worth worshiping and being happy about, This was incorporated into the Yule tradition. The Yule log symbolized the phallic shape of man and the transmutation of its essence through fire. In fact, they actually believe that each spark, the Norse did, each spark from the fire, from the log, represented a new pig or a calf that was to be born during the coming spring. Or at least the coming year. The end of December was a perfect time for celebration in most areas of Europe, because at that time most cattle were slaughtered, so they wouldn't have to be fed during winter when the supply of grain was undoubtedly pretty short. For many, it was the only time of year when they had a supply of fresh meat because of that. So in addition to that, it was also the time in which most wine and barley had perfectly fermented to drink and provide a nice warming beverage to celebrate that time of year with. So you can imagine all these things coincide for a nice winter vacation. In Rome, where winters weren't as harsh and nowhere near, didn't even touch those of the far North Germany and France, England, and Scandinavia. Saturnalia, a holiday in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture. Oh, I was thinking of Uranus, actually. And I just did that too. I should have remembered. I thought he was the god of the underworld, but I knew they cross paths sometimes. Saturnalia was undoubtedly going to be honored. God of agriculture, the pivotal point at which the sun starts to emerge ever increasingly longer. The duration of the day starts to grow. No doubt they would think that the winter solstice marked the point at which the forces that would allow spring to occur were starting to be in effect. So they would worship the beginnings of that. And beginning in the week leading up to the winter solstice and continuing for a full month, Saturnalia was actually a hedonistic time where food and drink were plentiful. In the normal Roman social order was actually turned upside down for a month. Slaves would become masters. Peasants were in command of the city. I mean, I don't know how legitimate their authority would be, but it's actually interesting that they kind of played this little fantasy out. They acted it out. Business and schools were closed so that everyone could join in the fun. And also around the time of the winter solstice, Romans observed Juvenalia, a feast honoring the children of Rome, the juveniles. In addition, members of the upper classes often celebrated the birthday of Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun, on December 25th. It was believed that Mithra, an infant god, was born of a rock. For some Romans, Mithra's birthday was the most sacred day of the year. Now in Christianity, the celebration of Christ's birth took a few centuries to be instantiated. In the early years of Christianity, Easter, his death, and subsequent resurrection was actually the focal point of celebration. In fact, during the first 2 centuries of Christianity, there was actually strong opposition to recognizing the actual birthdays of martyrs, or even Jesus. Martyrs, being people who have died, particularly for a religious cause. And numerous church fathers offered sarcastic comments about the pagan custom of celebrating birthdays, when in fact saints and martyrs should be celebrated for what ultimately defined their life, which was their death, as their actual birthday in the religious sense. However, in the context of so many existing celebrations of the rebirth of the star, the sun, the celestial sun, at the darkest point of winter, it's not a surprise that the birth of Jesus, being the God's literal son in human form and a symbol of hope for humanity, was eventually incorporated. It wasn't a surprise that he was ultimately made the centerpiece of this important time of the year. December 25th was first identified as the date of Jesus' birth by Sextus Julius Africanus in 221, and later became universally accepted as the date, but not without a little bit of a struggle. While, the linguistic sun and sun, S-U-N-S-O-N, and metaphorical connection of, the birth, the reemergence of longer days, and the, kind of that being symbolic for hope, for getting through another harsh winter and looking forward to warmer climates and more, fertile lands. Although you have those connections, a second view suggests that December 25th became the date of Jesus' birth by a priori reasoning that identified the spring equinox as the date of the creation of the world, and the fourth day of creation, which was when the light was created. So you see the connection between light, the emergence of a light bearer, of a hopeful figure, kind of the revivification, the thawing out of the people's hopes and dreams, I guess, in the depths, the darkest depths of winter. Astronomically, I guess you can see how that would be, how that might emerge as a system of beliefs. In the equinox, I just mentioned the equinox. Just like the winter and summer solstice being significant days wherein the winter is the darkest night of the year, the longest night, really. It's the dead of winter, December 21st, 2nd-ish. It's when the day is shortest. Summer solstice is the exact opposite in the northern hemisphere, of course. The southern hemisphere is the opposite of that. And I just saw ER's notification pop up, ASMR for people who hate Christmas, which might be a few of you if you haven't watched it after you watch this. That's funny. But back to the equinoxes. Yeah, so the solstices are the shortest and longest days of the year. The equinoxes happen in March, the late March and late September. The spring and fall equinoxes are, as you can imagine, the word equal. I forget who you were, but you corrected me on one of my videos the other day about this. And that it's the days in the year at which the day is equal in length to the night. And this was traditionally thought of as the day of actual creation in the biblical sense. And so they actually tied this in with the date of Jesus' conception. And this is significant because if Jesus was conceived during the spring equinox, which is late March, 9 months later would be late December. And of course, Jesus would then be born. So that's the general rationale for, at least one rationale for why we celebrate Christ's birthday in late December. So it's and there's multiple reasons, but I thought that was the most interesting one that I found. Now, despite this reasoning, there's also some evidence that he wasn't born in December, because in the stories of his birth, there were a lot of shepherds. There's a lot of animals being herded, and you might ask why there are shepherds herding in the middle of winter. But that's beyond me. I honestly don't know what to make of any of that. Regardless, though, December 25th is obviously what the church arrived at for the date of the birth of Jesus. This pretty much became canon, set in stone, when Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, declared December 25th as Jesus' birthday all the way back in 336 AD. And then this was further cemented when, only a couple years later, the actual Pope, Julius I, around 340 AD, I guess, officially made this, like a papal decree, made it official through the Vatican. So, now it's commonly believed that the church chose this date in an effort to adopt and absorb some of the traditions of the pagan Saturnalia festival. First called the Feast of the Nativity, the custom spread to Egypt by 432, and then to England by the end of the 6th century, in the 500s. By the end of the 8th century, in the 700s, Christianity actually, the celebration of Christmas had spread all the way into Scandinavia, supplanting a lot of the pagan winter solstice holidays. Today in the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, Christmas is actually celebrated 13 days after the 25th, which is also referred to as the Epiphany, or the Three Kings Days. Three Kings Day, that's what it is. This is the day it's believed that the three wise men finally found baby Jesus in the manger to give him their frankincense, myrrh, gold, and I think I recently read that it was actually marijuana or hemp. That was one of the gifts. Don't know how true that actually is. By holding Christmas at the same time as traditional winter solstice festivals, you can imagine it's another motivation for the church leaders to be doing this. It increased the chances that Christmas would be popularly embraced, but gave up the ability to dictate exactly how it was celebrated, because even though you try to rename the traditions and fuse, whenever you have a fusing, a melting pot, you're undoubtedly going to, if you thought the original product was pure, now it's going to be a little impure. It's going to be tainted by some things that you undoubtedly, if you're biased on one side or the other, are not going to want in the final product. But that was the price they paid for trying to, subvert the original pagan holidays and make it more, to Christianize it. By the Middle Ages, actually, Christianity had, for the most part, replaced all pagan religion. On Christmas, believers attended church, but then they celebrated ecstatically in a drunken, carnival-like manner. And the atmosphere is kind of like similar to today's Mardi Gras, really. Each year a beggar, and get this is pretty wild, or a student would be crowned the Lord of Misrule, and eager celebrants played the part of his subjects. Sorry, I gotta reposition here. The poor, okay, the poor would go around to the houses of the rich and demand their best food and drink. If owners failed to comply, their visitors would most likely terrorize them with mischief. Christmas became the time of year when the upper classes could repay their real or imagined debt to society by entertaining the less fortunate citizens. And the remnants of this ritual still exist, still very much alive in the form of charity and gift giving to organizations today. And so moving forward from the Middle Ages, and how that evolved, you can imagine 600 years later, about in 1652, following the execution of King Charles I, the Christ's Mass holiday was actually finally outlawed in all of England in a religious reform movement, essentially, that really swept the country, and it was led by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans took the biblical mandate seriously, which commanded that Christianity remained pure and separate from paganism. That means all their holidays as well. Despite their noble efforts, celebrations simply went underground, and by 1656, only 4 years later, under that ban, the public's demand for the legalization of Christ's Mass Christmas, the demand just became insurmountable, and the appointment of Charles II to the throne restored England's monarchy, and with it the celebration of Christ's Mass. So the Puritans had lost England, but what they held were very high hopes for the New World over, I guess, here. When the first settlers came from England, they were, for the most part, Puritans. So they came over here mostly, actually entirely, for religious freedom. They came here to be free to worship God without a hierarchy, without the corruption of the organized church as they saw it, that they had known in England, and with its ties to Europe and Rome. As with all hierarchies, there's no doubt a tendency towards tyranny. And when they came with a clear knowledge of the dangers of the pagan rituals of the past that had actually become so dear to the hearts of their ancestors. Following England's lead in 1659, the colonies of the Americas, had likewise outlawed Christmas for 200 years until the mid-1800s. The clergy in New England actually battled to keep the riot celebrations honoring the pagan god Saturn from infiltrating the New World. Even the Reverend Cotton Mather, who played a significant role in the Salem witch trials, had warned in a Christmas Day sermon, 1712, quote, "Can you in your conscience think that your holy Savior is honored by hard drinking, lewd reveling, and by a mass fit for none but Bacchus, the god of wine, or Saturn? But the public's taste for sin and revelry persisted, and in 1828, gang rioting during the Saturnalia-like Christmas celebrations got so bad that New York actually had to had to create basically a professional police force for the first time in order, to control the nonsense going on. Yeah, in fact, before the mid-1800s, Christmas was not only not widely celebrated, but in many places it was actually outlawed because of the behavior it instigated. And this was because of the attitude towards it by many of the churches who regarded it as primarily, a pagan celebration and therefore a reproach to the Lord. By the mid-19th century, American churches, though, were the last, so the mid-1800s. The holiday had crept into popular celebration, really, that there were only a handful of churches that were the last remaining holdouts to banning the religion. And around this time, a fairly large institution called the American Sunday School Society argued that children could actually be taught about the birth of Christ through the reenactment of the Nativity. So they offered some candy and treats as well as a means of kind of trying to, ride on the coattails of the already celebrated holiday in order to re-Christianize it and use its innate popularity to try to incorporate the message of the birth of Jesus to the younger children. And it actually did pretty successfully catch on as a means of enticing families into accepting the holiday despite its notorious history. The successful technique of bribing children with candy actually, and that's a whole new story. I never got around to doing a history of Halloween, but that actually ties hand in hand with the origins, in America at least, of kids dressing up as Halloween spooky demon schools, evil characters to go knock on people's doors to get candy. So ultimately, though the overwhelming significant cause of the popularization of making Christmas what it is today was actually Charles Dickens in his story, the ghostly 1843 book, A Christmas Carol. And that's really what cemented Christmas as a holiday in the hearts of Americans forever. Dickens' story made the pagan Christmas feasts, the shining trees, the glittering shops, and the family warmth irresistible to the American public wanting to experience the holiday. Coming to America about 25 years later in 1867, or 24, I guess, to promote his work, Charles Dickens packed theaters to read stories of the Christmas Carol, and it gripped America and destroyed, ultimately, any final resolve to ban it and stop the evolution of Christmas as a national holiday. By 1875, the Puritans had all but been beaten, and by 1890, all American states had voted to make Christmas a legal holiday. So it's interesting that we think of it as, I would have guessed it was like this for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it was actually banned, just outright banned in America until really just, maybe 200 years ago, and not really an established, an officially recognized holiday until 128 years ago, I guess. So, alright, that's the story of the actual holiday. But now what about the specifics? And, there are a lot of paraphernalia, Christmas paraphernalia that we love to incorporate into, infuse into the holiday, which kind of defines the holiday, makes it what it is, in a way. From the trees to the gifts to the characters that we're all familiar with. As for the Christmas tree, the fir tree, the mistletoe, the wreath, they typically come from overtly pagan traditions all across Northern Europe. Evergreen trees have always represented sex and fertility in pagan cultures. During the winter solstice, trees would be chopped down, brought inside, set up, and decorated as idols for worship. And there's actually a little passage in the Bible that I forgot to add, but I remembered it was someone telling Jeremiah, I think it was. It might have been in the Bible, God directly telling Jeremiah not to participate in the Germanic pagan traditions of worshiping a tree. But yeah, I forget the essence of the story. So that's where it originated from. The pagans regarded these evergreen trees being evergreen and not ever dying like most other trees do. Trees and the entire groves of trees, as you can imagine, as being sacred. So the bringing of the tree into the house would be a way of bringing the supernatural source of blessing into your home. The whole idea was that there were spirits who resided in these trees. Even though there is some uncertainty about the precise date and origin of the Christmas tree, it appears that the fir trees, decorated with apples, were the first known in Strasbourg, in Germany, in 1605. The first use of candles on such trees is recorded, which is crazy, by the way. It's like putting a match in oil refinery. The first use of candles was by a Silesian duchess in 1611. No doubt she had the affluency to take that risk. The advent of the wreath, made of fir branches, of even more recent origin, especially in North America. In the Middle Ages, though, the tradition of the winter solstice Christmas tree primarily took place in Germany. During his reign, King George I, himself of German extraction, brought the custom to Victorian England. German immigrants settling in Pennsylvania did the same in America in the early 1800s. And in 1848, the London Illustrated News published a famous engraving depicted the Queen Victoria, and a royal family beside a decorated Christmas tree. And within a few years, nearly every English household had their own tree in allegiance to the monarchy. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? By 1900, the U.S. Forest Service estimated that at least 1 in 5 homes in America had adopted the Christmas tree tradition. So that's still only 20%, like 115 years ago, 118 years ago. That was easy math. Why didn't I do it? But yeah, definitely, as we'll find out in just a little bit, Odin and other gods were thought to live amongst the German forests. They're so full, so dense with, saturated with mythology. So you can imagine bringing home a tree that always stays green would be a sign of letting in a hopefully good spirits into your home. Especially when they're pretty much a ticking piece of dynamite, Bringing something like that in your, it'd be like, I don't know, moistening your doormat with gasoline or something. I feel like that's definitely pretty risky, especially if you don't have much and your house is made of actual kindle. But anyways, Santa Claus is another good example of the pagan element of Christmas. Santa Claus, as we know today, is an amalgamation of several different traditions. But in most cultures throughout the world, you'll find the existence of what is known as Hearth Gods. And these are gods who guard the hearth in the chimney and keep the fires burning, make sure the food cooks properly, and the people were warm. Typically, the Hearth God, dressed in red, will come down the chimney, and they're going to reward those who have pleased him throughout the course of the previous year. To lay crushes or axes or other forms of true punishment upon those who have displeased him. And the concept of Santa Claus has just a really, really long history, though, just beyond that. Beginning once again in Scandinavia, Santa's original incarnation was in the form of Odin, the pagan god of thunder, which traditionally was a tall fellow with a long, flowing beard who inhabited the spirit-infested Nordic forests. Germans were terrified of Odin, as they believed he made nocturnal flights through the sky to observe his people and then decide who would prosper and who would perish. Because of his presence, many people actually chose to stay inside. In England, Odin eventually evolved into Father Christmas, who, crowned with sprigs of holly, travels the countryside getting roaring drunk. As part of the festival, frequently, he would be accompanied by a horned goat. Ironically, this is pretty much the symbol of Satan, the biblical symbol of the devil influencing those who reject the salvation of Jesus Christ. According to the Church of Rome, traditionally also there was a Turkish bishop named Nicholas. Now, this was one of the more officially recognized origins of Santa Claus. There was a Turkish bishop, or, Asia Minor. I should have said that the other way around. But modern-day Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, where Troy is across the way from Greece, there was a bishop in the 300s, 4th century. A Turkish bishop named Nicholas who hailed from Mithra during the 4th century. He was known as the patron saint of seafaring men. And his story, one of the best-known St. Nicholas stories, is that he saved 3 poor sisters from being sold into slavery or prostitution by their father by providing them with a dowry so that they could be married. A dowry being a gift that the women traditionally had to pay, or the woman's father, if he had it, pay the male as a gift for essentially taking care of his wife for the remainder of her life. And of course, that's a crude way of putting it. It's deeper than that. It's as a gift of being faithful to his daughter for the rest of his life. It might be a little more appropriate, a little more, what's the word? Fidelity. I don't know. A little more traditionally accurate, I guess. So, St. Nicholas provided the dowry for 3 females, 3 daughters, to avoid potential slavery and prostitution. Over the course of many years, Nicholas's popularity then spread, and he became known as the protector of children and sailors. His feast day is celebrated on the anniversary of his death, December 6th, and this was traditionally considered a lucky day to make large purchases or even get married. By the Renaissance, 1,000 years later, Saint Nicholas was the most popular saint in all of Europe. Even after the Protestant Reformation, when the veneration of saints began being very much discouraged, Saint Nicholas maintained a positive reputation, especially in Holland, apparently. And over the centuries, the legend began to unfold, as it was rumored that Saint Nicholas had actually captured the devil himself, put him in chains, and made him his personal servant. Recognized in various cultures, the assistant of Sinterklaas is best known by his German name Ruprecht. Described as a hideous horned creature, the servant Ruprecht was a dark and sinister figure who stood in stark contrast to the saintly Nicholas. Somehow Father Christmas's companion, the horned goat, had metamorphosized, I guess, into the foreboding horned devil called Ruprecht, as Saint Nicholas traveled from house to house, inquiring about the behavior of the children within. Ruprecht would drop candy and gifts down the chimney into the good children's shoes. It was from this story that we get our traditional hanging of stockings on the mantle for Christmas Eve. And if able to recite a verse or demonstrate a skill for Saint Nicholas, the child would receive a gift. If unable to, he or she would receive a switch or a whip, as it's now called. And Ruprecht, by the way, also carried a large sack in which to stuff children and take them away if they'd been really bad. As more and more Christian churches began combining pagan rituals with the winter solstice celebration of the birth, as more and more Christian churches began combining the pagan rituals of the winter solstice with the birth of Christ, the emphasis on St. Nicholas's role began to shift. Moving into more modern times, relative to 1,000 years ago, St. Nicholas made his first inroads in America into the popular culture of America towards the end of the 18th century. In December of 1773, and then again a year later, a New York newspaper reported that groups of Dutch families from Holland gathered to honor the anniversary of St. Nicholas's death. By 1809, the famous writer Washington Irving actually helped popularize Sinterklaas stories when he referred to St. Nicholas as the patron saint of New York in his book, The History of New York. Even more significant was 1822, the Episcopalian minister Clement Clark Moore penned a decidedly secular tale, so it wasn't really a religious tale, called A Visit from St. Nicholas, later retitled The Night Before just The Night Before Christmas. The Night Before Christmas. Moore's poem was based on the tales of German and Dutch immigrants who had come to America. Intended originally for only his own children, the story it was published in the Troy Sentinel of New York and became an overnight sensation. Gone were the remnants of disciplinarian St. Nicholas. He was now a jolly old elf, imbued with supernatural powers. And Moore had also replaced Nicholas's companion, the horned devil Ruprecht, with 8-horned magical reindeer. Or 8-horned. And there's also a whole nother part about how there's even a lot of modern Christian Christians fighting the concept of Santa Claus because children, in essence, almost worship Santa Claus instead of worshiping Jesus. You know, they have, he's a gift bearer, he's jolly, he keeps track of your morality throughout the year, he's omniscient, he's magical. There's a lot of overlapping qualities that they think take away from what is supposed to be the primary focus of Christmas, which is the birth of the Savior of the human race, Jesus Christ. So there's that little side note, but I didn't want to bore you, it was way too long. Other Santa Claus traditions all around the world include a jolly elf named Yule Tradition. Alright, hold on, let me do that. Yule Tradition. I think Yule Tradition in Scandinavia, who delivers gifts from a sled pulled by goats. Père Noël, or Père Noël, I'm sorry I'm butchering these, is responsible in France for filling the shoes of children who leave their, good children, who leave their shoes by, well, it doesn't say, I feel like I remember it was like outdoors or something, filling them with gifts. In Russia, it's believed that an elderly woman named Babushka purposely gave the wise men going to give gifts to Jesus the wrong directions so that they couldn't find Jesus. But later on she felt remorseful but couldn't find them to undo her harm, undo the damage. So to this day, on January 5th, Babushka visits Russian children, leaving gifts at their bedsides in the hope that one of them is the baby Jesus, and she will be forgiven. In Italy, a similar story exists about a woman called La Befana, a kindly witch who rides a broomstick down chimneys of Italian homes to deliver toys into the stockings of lucky children. As for the modern look of Santa Claus in the West, it wasn't until the late 19th century that the image of Santa became standardized as a full-sized adult dressed in red with white fur trim. The jolly, chubby, grandfatherly face of this Santa was largely created by Thomas Nast, a great political cartoonist of the 1800s, actually. However, Nast did leave him half-sized in homage to his elf origins. Yeah, it's interesting that Santa was, he's pretty much an overgrown elf. He's like the king of the elves. And lastly, it's the tradition of giving gifts. Towards the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, the practice of giving gifts to family members became well established. Theologically, the feast day reminded Christians of God's gift to Jesus. God's gift of Jesus to humankind. Even as the coming of the wise men, the Magi, to Bethlehem suggested that Christmas was somehow related to giving gifts. The practice of giving gifts, which actually goes back all the way to the 1400s, contributed to the view that Christmas was a secular holiday focused on family and friends. This was one reason why Puritans in Old and New England opposed that celebration. They thought it was too secular. But in most European countries today, gifts are exchanged on Christmas Eve. I actually didn't know that. I always thought it was always Christmas morning. In keeping with the notion that the baby Jesus was born on the night of the 24th. But the morning of December 25th, however, is when gifts are exchanged over here in America. And yeah, undoubtedly the marketing has had a huge effect ever since the 30s, 1940s, 50s. Gets in songs and movies and theatricals and plays, art, all over the place, all over malls, stores. It's become very, what's the word? It's been capitalized upon, we'll put it that way. And of course, Coca-Cola, famous images of Santa have been pretty much made tradition through the artistic renderings of jolly old fat men ever since it was created in the mid-1800s, or the late 1800s, early 1900s. But I figured I'd stop there. I thought that was pretty thorough, and there's great movies like Elf, Christmas Vacation, which is probably my favorite, Christmas Story, all these great movies, Home Alone 2, that kind of made my childhood. But I think the deeper past is pretty interesting, and how it's a slow consensus of what it is, and regardless of whether you're Christian or not, and even if you are Christian, whether you celebrate Santa Claus and gift giving, or just purely stick to just worshiping and celebrating the Nativity and the birth of Jesus, I think we can all recognize that Christmas is a time of sharing good memories and good spirits, in the hopes that we can make this world a little bit better. And I hope I can play a small part in that as well with this whole episode. So if you guys loved it, that's a gift enough for me. Other than that, I just want to wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and my best to you and your family. Bye.